Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Looking at risk through one tool at a time can leave gaps in how the full system is understood. That's prompting a closer look at how assessments are connected and how they guide choices. For a look at how those pieces could work together differently in the Coast Guard, I'm joined by Susan Resetar and Eric Cooper of RAND. Susan and Eric, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us. This is a great opportunity, so really appreciate it.
Eric, I want to start with you. You've got an interesting report out talking about how the Coast Guard manages waterway safety risk. Talk to us first about what their responsibility is in assessing waterway safety risk, and maybe what's changed in the operating environment that made this the time to really look at their processes.
Yeah, so the Coast Guard, their responsibilities for all navigable waterways in the United States. So that stretches all the way from the Great Lakes down through the inland waterways into the Gulf, across all the approaches and departures from the United States. So it's a really wide area of responsibility. And one of the biggest drivers for this particular study on risk was the collision of the Dali with the motor vessel Dali with the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore in 2024. As you probably know, there was a catastrophic collapse of that main span. That killed 6 people, and it closed that waterway into Baltimore for nearly 3 months, at a cost of about $15 million per day. And so following that bridge collision, the Coast Guard formed a board of investigation into the specific accident to figure out why the accident occurred, along with the NTSB. But they also subsequently formed what was called a board of inquiry that looked at what are the risks to critical port infrastructure due to the changes in the marine environment, which include the size of commercial vessels, increased traffic density over the last few decades. Much of the infrastructure in the waterways is really decades old, right? And it was built with these specific assumptions. But those assumptions have changed. The Key Bridge was built in the 70s, but since that time, the Panama Canal has expanded. It's got ships that are 3 times its size that transit to the East Coast now. And so given that confluence of events, the Coast Guard made that decision to really look at a holistic review of its multiple risk assessment tools and see if there was a way to do some improvement across that entire risk spectrum, which is obviously very important, right? Because 90% of our volume of trade is coming in through the maritime environment.
And Susan, Eric mentioned the tools that the Coast Guard is currently using. As you all started to evaluate those tools, what did you find? Are they working well? Are they being used appropriately?
Yes. So before I sort of dive into some of the details of what we found, it might be helpful to kind of review that there are predominantly six tools that the Coast Guard uses to assess risk. And each of these tools has been developed to look at a specific issue, for a specific purpose. So it might be helpful to kind of quickly review. So there's sort of a large-scale risk assessment that looks at approaches to the waterways a little further out from the coast, perhaps. And that there could be a lot of activities there, including infrastructure, wind farms, aquaculture, and that sort of thing. So it looks at approaches to these ports and waterways. They also have approaches for looking at new infrastructure sort of in the harbor or in the port, and some specialized tools looking at liquid natural gas. So there's a few tools that look at that level and at that particular situation. And then there are other tools that look more at navigation and safety and look at, are the buoys in the right places? Are there other navigational aids that need to be employed? So it's quite a diverse set of tools that were designed specifically for those particular purposes. There's also ad hoc kinds of safety risk assessments that go on with one-time event that needs a permit, kind of a thing. So what we did is to systematically look at each tool, and across the tools was develop a conceptualized risk management framework that's derived from well-established authoritative risk management frameworks developed by the International Risk Governance Council, Department of War, DHS, and Coast Guard itself. So we looked at the best of the best and developed this conceptual framework that we wanted to use to assess these tools individually and as a whole. And this framework includes 6 sort of risk management steps, if you will. The first being scoping and goal setting. So we've kind of alluded to the fact that, that many of these tools have different scopes and goals. Then the risk assessment, what are we worried about? Risk from what? What have we identified? How much? The characterization phase. Okay, once we've identified sources of risk, how much risk is there? The evaluation phase involves how much is acceptable. You can't buy down risk to zero. There will always be some level of risk. So working with stakeholders, what's acceptable in this particular waterway? And then manage. What do we do about this risk? And monitor. Have what we decided to do has it been successful? So those are sort of the 6 steps. I won't go into any more detail on those. So for using this framework, what we did was we looked at the 6 tools. And for example, one of the elements we looked at was the goal setting and scoping. So we did a qualitative assessment of how extensive, if you will, each tool was in terms of the risk assessment piece. So how far along did they sort of take this calculation, if you will? What kinds of drivers, what risk drivers and hazards did they consider? And then in terms of the Coast Guard, what are the marine planning activities did they cover down on? So we mentioned aids to navigation is a focus, could be an element. Location of infrastructure could be another element. And we found there was quite a range. We sort of plotted these up, and so there's a lot of variance in terms of the scoping from the get-go. And so we found one in particular, the ports and waterways safety assessment was, generally speaking, the most comprehensive in terms of those 3 elements. And that is one that, they all involve a lot of stakeholders. We also looked at a lot of the risk assessments at the risk assessment steps. So this is, what are these risk drivers that each of these tools considered? And we developed, because the Coast Guard didn't have sort of a full suite of risk drivers, we were able to pull that together from various Coast Guard documents, but we pulled it together in one spot. So we call these sort of the captain of the port priorities. What are we concerned about protecting? And then looking at across the range of risk drivers, from environmental conditions to vessel traffic and so forth. And we found that, again, there were areas that had good coverage, perhaps not surprising. Historical information on surface vessel traffic and environmental conditions was pretty well covered by all the tools. But there were other areas such as subsurface vessels, human factors, and cybersecurity, or even future, thinking about what the future conditions that weren't always covered as well. So there were some gaps in those spaces, if you will. And then finally, on this particular question, I'd like to, one of the things that sort of struck me, I'm not quite the Coast Guard expert that Coop is, although I've been working with the Coast Guard for a while, is how different each port and waterway is, right? And so these tools have to be robust enough to be applied in a variety of settings. And that just accentuates the importance of having local knowledge, local engagement with stakeholders. And Coast Guard does very well in that regard. They routinely work with, stakeholders in the port, such as the Harbor Safety Committee, Area Maritime Security Committee, and the pilot associations. Those were named most often. So there's a strong connection there. But I think one of the important things here is that it's important to understand how these tools are applied at the local level, being able to have the expertise and knowledge to do that.
Susan Resetar and Eric Cooper are policy and operations research analysts at RAND. Eric, let me come back to you. Susan's just kind of walked us through the framework and the tools. What did you hear from the Coast Guard as you went through this report? How receptive are they to the proposals? And if they adopted this risk management framework, what would change in how they make decisions?
Yeah, Coast Guard, working with Coast Guard is great. They're very receptive to understanding what the challenges are and how to make those changes. One of the things that we think the Coast Guard will have some challenges with is the fact that there needs to be, as Sue mentioned, a data integration that has standardized protocols across the different tools so that those tools can be categorized and that you can create prioritization for what's important. some of the problems that they have is that when they do the assessment, there isn't necessarily a follow through. And part of that is because there's a lot of owners in the waterway. And so when the decisions are made, they may be passed to a different agency, and that agency may not have the funding. It may not have the same prioritization. So some of those changes fall through the gaps. But what might be a little challenging is just to build that integration of the data standards for the Coast Guard across their entire protocol to make sure that each of the tools are being measured in the same sort of process. So, but the Coast Guard is very receptive to making those changes, and I think that they'll look to do that. We haven't seen their board of inquiry report; it hasn't been released yet, but I think that's going to come out shortly.
And Sue, let me come back to you. This seems like a problem that is not unique to the Coast Guard. Lots of federal agencies are responsible for assessing and managing risk. If you were to take this risk management framework, how else might you think that folks could apply it?
I think it's, again, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, we drew this from well-established authoritative risk management frameworks that are out there. I think it's pretty adaptable. It's very closely aligned to what, the rest of DHS does and what DOW does. There might be some issues when you talk about cybersecurity and information technology. There might be some more specificity that would be needed, but I think it's very adaptable.
I've been speaking with Susan Resetar. She's a senior operations researcher at RAND, and Eric Cooper is a senior policy researcher at RAND. Thank you both for sharing the report with us and for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Terry. This was fantastic. Appreciate it.
We'll post this interview and a link to their report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.